Hello, everybody. Dr. Vasquez here. Today is Sunday, the 23rd of July in the year 2023. And right now I'm going to talk about two different topics. One is kind of personal and the other is kind of social, but I guess they're both social ultimately. So, I also meant to look up, before I started this video, I meant to look up two quotes from Nietzsche where he says two things that I think have value. Well, I mean, he says a lot of things I think have value, but relative to this conversation, I want to say two things from Nietzsche that kind of frame my approach to what we're about to talk about collectively in this social collective consciousness, as Henry Rollins would say. So he says two things that are relevant to this in particular. He says, in addition to his entire philosophy for that matter, but he says, I contradict as has never been contradicted, but I am nonetheless the opposite of a negative spirit. I'll try to provide the quote when I take the time to look it up, and I'll put it in the video. But again, he says, I contradict. He may have said contradict and criticize, depending on how the quote is actually read. But he could say something like, I contradict and criticize as no one ever has, but I'm not. He says, I am nonetheless the opposite of a negative spirit. So his intention was to criticize things ultimately for the good of humanity, because Nietzsche was uniquely positive in his philosophy, even though the route to his positivity was through the negativity of society. You know, he would describe how horrible things were and then say, here's how it could be better. Whereas a lot of philosophers either didn't provide that level of analysis or they never got to what was going to be better. If you look at Schopenhauer, for example, he was critical, but he never got to the other side. And so Schopenhauer was very important for Nietzsche because Schopenhauer's philosophy was ultimately pessimistic, famously pessimistic. And so Nietzsche was able to use Schopenhauer kind of as a stepping stone, so to speak, and then say, okay, well, now you've criticized the entire world and you've made existence look horrible. But so what are you going to do about it? Like, what could you do about it to make it better? And that was the step that Nietzsche was able to take. And arguably, he couldn't have made that step without the pessimism of Schopenhauer or Kierkegaard, for that matter. So Kierkegaard was famously pessimistic also, and that's why he turned to Christianity, because he said life is worthless. The only hope we have is to believe in God, and he's the one who made up the phrase "leap of faith." He basically said, well, I mean, he said a lot of things, of course, but and some of his social observations were actually pretty acute. But he basically said life isn't worth living, so I'm going to take the leap of faith that God exists, and that'll make my life worthwhile. That's basically Kierkegaard in a nutshell. Whereas Schopenhauer kind of said life isn't worth living, and the best you can do is kind of escape with, music and art. And under that influence, of course, is why Nietzsche wrote his first book, Birth of Tragedy, when he was under the influence of Wagner. And Wagner's music at that time. But anyway, he eventually kind of outgrew those myopic perspectives. So anyway, back to this. The reason I want to talk about this stuff isn't to be negative, it's to ultimately be positive. I did record about 2 days ago, I recorded 14 minutes of video, and this morning I recorded another 12 minutes of video when I was out in the public sphere. And from that criticism of the public sphere, I'm going to write down a few of the notes that I started to organize. I think I have 8 points in my mind from today's exercise session that netted me a total of 5 pi points, and that's the other topic I want to get to eventually. Probably not in this conversation. But I'm going to start writing things down just to maintain some possibility of order. So I did go, let's see if this is ready to roll. I did go to the park today, and so my park experience was, in addition to exercise, for something else that I want to talk about later, was just the observation of the park experience here in the United States. So I'll say social experience. And I'm going to get past that pretty quickly because I actually want to talk about the main points. So the main points that I want to make, I'm just going to write them out real quick because I want to come back to these later after we've looked at this new article from the new Surgeon General here in the United States. So the points that I want to make are as follows. If you look at like a European park, whoa, we have to do that one again, versus an American park. These are just observations. And of course we can find exceptions on either side, but I'm just talking generally, having lived in the United States for 40 years and lived in Europe for about 9 years. These are the distinctions that I see in the public spaces. I'm going to say public parks to be more specific. Oops. European parks usually have bathrooms. American parks don't. Usually a European park will have kind of a kiosk area where people can buy drink and food. So I'm going to put food and drink. Whereas a lot of American parks, no bathroom, no food, and no drink. So your time in an American park is very limited. You got no bathroom, you got no food and drink. You have to bring your own picnic food, but you're still going to run out of bladder space eventually. So your time is going to be limited in an American park. The relevance of that, so I've wanted to comment on that, and I've done a few videos that I've just recorded on my phone when I was at the park doing exercise. But I want to connect those ideas with this new Surgeon General advisory raises. Oh, I thought they were saying new Surgeon General, but now apparently they're saying new Surgeon General advisory. Raises alarm about the devastating impact of epidemic of loneliness and isolation in the United States. So I'm just going to say this my way. Some of you will be offended by it, but at least you'll get the message if I say it straightforward way. These are the same dumbasses and bastards who closed down the country and forced people into isolation. Now they're saying, oh, now they're going to bitch and moan about the devastating impact of epidemic of loneliness and isolation in the United States. And they're the people who helped create that. They did help create it recently, but they have always pushed Americans into living in an isolated way. And now they're going to complain about it. So a couple of famous studies have been published, and I've written about these in my book. But for sure, at least one of them was 20 years old. And what they showed then, so let's say this was around 2000 or so, plus or minus, to make it 20 years old. What they showed back then is that the typical American only has one friend, or is like 1.2 friends, or no, I'm sorry, it was I think it was 1.2 social contacts. Only one confidant, only one person that could really be trusted. So we're not just talking about going out for burgers and beer. We're talking about people who are available for a true, meaningful connection. Typical American has less, or approximately one friend, according to the data 20 years ago. They repeated that study a couple years later, and they found that it had reduced so that now the typical American had no friends. And that was before the pandemic, which of course forced people into more isolation. So that's why I was keen to see this coming from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. I mean, what service are they providing when they themselves are the ones pushing people into more isolation? So again, you can see this is from an official website of the United States government. I'll put the original link on the webpage at healthythinking.substack.com. And so again, this was just published in May. We're going to take a look at it in just a moment. But before I get to that, I want to talk about American public spaces and public parks that don't have bathrooms, don't have food, don't have drink, nowhere to. In European parks, you can sit down and watch people walk by. In American parks, a lot of times you don't get a place to sit. You don't get a cover for rain. Well, I'm sorry, you do in Europe, but not here in the U.S. You don't get that here. So again, that means you can't use the park on a rainy day. Whereas in Europe, where people are out and about much more, typically, almost, I mean, that's almost the expectation. You've got some type of rain cover, and that also serves on sunny days where you get some shade from the sun. Not at the parks, not at most of the American parks. The other thing, and so this will take us to 9 points. The other thing that makes European parks, of course, beautiful is they usually have some type of art, usually sculpture, but not in American parks. 8, you get usually a water feature, usually a fountain. And sometimes the fountain is itself the art. So putting a fountain gives a focal point to the park. Sorry, let me get this out of here. That provides a focal point to the park. Usually it's in the center, of course, or slightly off center. But that provides something beautiful to look at, and it's a water feature because people like to see water, just like they like to see plants, because water and plants represent to us, on a biological level, they represent safety and security and survivability. I mean, you got to have water and food. So that's why people like to look at water fountains and gardens and things like that. What was the other thing? Oh, yeah, the other thing that I just noticed today is you get some landscaping. But not where I am. So right now, I live in a major American city, and we're close to the center of the city. I mean, we're not downtown, of course, but we're not in the burbs at all. And we're in a better neighborhood, let's say. So on the scale of whatever, we're at least above the 50% line in terms of this is. I live on a historic street. We live in a historic house, as you can tell by the fireplace behind me. So this is a very properly developed neighborhood. I drive 1 mile to go to the park, and these were the reflections I had today. No bathroom, no food, no drink, no seating, no cover for rain, no cover for shade, no art, no water feature like a fountain, and no landscape. And so, of course, the park is just dead. So hopefully the importance of that is obvious when we then look at this new Surgeon General advisory raising the alarm about the devastating impact of the epidemic, and that's a lot of verbiage, of loneliness and isolation in the United States. So, I don't know who this guy is, but if I recall correctly, he's the same guy who called for, lockdowns and social distancing. I mean, come on. The irony here is just too much to pass up. So this is an advisory. It's an alarm. We're talking about devastating impact here. Come on. Stupid highlighter thing. Let's go. You can do it. Sorry. Let's try one more time to competently highlight that. Devastating. So it's not only devastating, but it's an impact. That drives the point home even more. And it's an epidemic as if it were an infectious disease, but we're really just talking about the same loneliness. Come on. And isolation in the United States that we haven't done anything about for the last 20, 40, 50 years. So the park that I was in today probably is 200 years old. The city where I live is got to be 200 years old. Yeah, it has to be because, it just is. So we've got universities here that were founded right around the time the country was founded, like in the 1770s. So this city where I live is more than 200 years old, and this park isn't new. So I'm assuming it's, close to 200 years old or something. And it's got nothing. So in 200 years, it's a park designed to create isolation. And I'll show you the video of the park either now or later or both. So let's take a look at what they're now discovering as a problem, which has been obvious forever. Today, United States Surgeon General, what's his name, released a new Surgeon General advisory calling attention to the public health crisis of loneliness, isolation, and lack of connection in our country. So it's not just my neighborhood. This is across the country, according to the U.S. Surgeon General, and of course that's true. I don't know why that stupid thing stays floating there. Even before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic that they totally screwed up, and they paid $18,000 per American citizen for the complete failure of a response that resulted in 4 times more deaths than the rest of the world. So we spent more money and we had worse outcomes. I mean, that's what America does all the time. Look at healthcare in the United States. It's more expensive for worse outcomes. Look at transit in the United States. More expensive for worse outcomes. Even before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, approximately half of U.S. adults reported experiencing measurable levels of loneliness. Disconnection fundamentally affects our mental, physical, and societal health. In fact, loneliness and isolation increase the risk for individuals to develop mental health challenges in their lives, and lack of connection can increase the risk for premature death to levels comparable to smoking daily. So if you're isolated and you sit a lot, which they've also said is worse than smoking, then you're like smoking 2 packs a day. And that's probably most of the country that would qualify for that, which is why we're going to talk about pie later on. Surgeon General's advisory on our epidemic of loneliness and isolation. I don't know where this guy's from. If it's the person that I have in mind, I think maybe he was born and raised in the U.S., or maybe he's from another country and then came here, or his family of origin is from another country or whatever. My point is, I just want to see if these are American solutions to American problems, which means it's not going to be the right solution, or if these are going to be like a worldview set of solutions. So let's just see what he says. Surgeon General's advisory lays out a framework for a national strategy. So again, this document and his statement was a team effort. So they probably had, a group of 6 to 12 to 20 people working on this, and they revised it, they edited it, they sent it for probably an independent PR review before they sent it out. So I'm guessing maybe 30 people worked on this document, right? So I'm going to critique it spontaneously because I'm reading it right now for the first time. And let's just see what the estimated value of this document is. They're calling this a framework for a national strategy. Okay, so this is a strategy. This isn't just, hey, I'm going to get back to you later. This is a strategy. So let's see what their strategy comes up with. Let's see if it even talks about public parks. Which has never been implemented before in the United States. So I'm going to say that one more time because they're rolling this up to be important. A national strategy to advance social connection, which has never been implemented before in the United States. It details recommendations that individuals, governments, workplaces, health systems, and community organizations can take to increase connection in their lives, communities, and across the country to improve health. Our epidemic, let me get that up there. Our epidemic of loneliness and isolation has been an underappreciated public health crisis. Here we go, we're having another crisis. It is a crisis. That has harmed individual and societal health. Our relationships are a source of healing and well-being, hiding in plain sight, one that can help us live healthier, more fulfilled, and more productive lives. according to the U.S. Surgeon General, whatever his name is, Vivek Murthy. Okay, so that's his name. Given the significant health consequence, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but I didn't want to exercise the effort to pronounce his name, and then I did it correctly, or at least as correctly as I can do it. Given the significant health consequences of loneliness and isolation, we must prioritize building social connection in the same way we have prioritized other public health issues, other critical public health issues, such as tobacco. So he's putting this on the same level as tobacco, obesity, substance abuse. Why don't they just say addiction? Together we can build a country that's healthier, more resilient, less lonely, and more connected. Well, I think only a complete fool would think that they actually want to do any of those things, but I'll at least give them a highlight. So I'm going to highlight that. I'll change the color because it's worthy of a different color. The physical health consequences of poor or insufficient connection include a 29% increased risk of heart disease. That's pretty big. So that's more significant than either taking or not taking a statin drug, and statin drugs are a multi-billion-dollar industry. 32% increased risk of stroke, 50% increased risk of developing dementia for older adults. Those are all huge numbers, huge numbers. You know, if you look at most clinical studies, I mean, come on, if they get like a 10% shift, that's considered like a miracle for, like in cancer drugs and heart disease and things like that. 10% is huge, and here we are talking about 32%, 50%, and 29% for heart disease. So those are huge numbers, huge percentages. Premature death by 60%. Well, I don't think they really care about premature death. In addition to our physical health, loneliness and isolation contribute substantially to mental health challenges in adults. So here's what I want to say, because this is a conversation that we have all the time here in the United States. We talk about mass shootings. What's the solution to mass shootings? According to all, it's either gun control or nothing, gun control or nothing, gun control or nothing. No one ever talks about like building a healthy society or giving people something to hope for. That's legitimate. And here's what I wanted to say about mass shootings. All mass shootings are suicide by cop. So if you look up the phrase suicide by cop, that's where people engage in whatever behavior, stealing cars, thievery, whatever, to provoke the police to kill them because they don't have the wherewithal to commit suicide. So it's called suicide by cop, but it looks like a crime because it is a crime, but it's a crime with the intention of provoking their own suicide via a shooting by the police. So all mass shootings are suicide by cop, but the American conversation never states that, and to me it's quite obvious. And we have mass shootings here all the time. But what do they talk about? They talk about gun control. Come on. In addition to our physical health, loneliness and isolation contribute substantially to mental health challenges in adults. The risk of developing depression among people who report feeling lonely is often more than double that who rarely or never feel lonely. Loneliness and social isolation in childhood increase the risk for depression, anxiety, both immediately and well into the future. And with more than 1 in 5 adults and more than 1 in 3 young adults living with mental illness in the United States, that's pretty sick. 1 in 5, that's 20%, and young adults, 30%. Whoa. Addressing loneliness and isolation is critical in order to fully address the mental health crisis of America. Yeah, well, I mean, it's more than just that, of course. So when people spend time together, it's not just, hey, let's go get a burger. When people talk, that provides them an opportunity, as you can see right now, it provides them an opportunity to organize their thoughts. So if part of the value of social connection is speaking, and speaking requires even if it's spontaneous, speaking requires people to, obligates people to organize their ideas better than they were typically before. I know it's true for me, and that's one of the reasons why I like teaching so much, is because in the process of teaching, I come up with new ideas I didn't even have when I started the lecture. And like, for example, I went to the park today, and you'll see that this list just came up spontaneously as I was at the park. But I didn't go to the park with these ideas. I was at the park doing exercise, and I was just looking around me at how dead this park was. And I started to, compare and contrast my experience here in the U.S. with my experience in Barcelona, for example. And I was like, if I were in Barcelona, and I'll show you some pictures of this beautiful park in Barcelona, I would be looking at fountains, dragons, golden horses, architecture. That's another thing that should go on my list. So I'm going to put architecture, structures, something worth looking at. And I'll say something else from a different presentation that I've posted. All of these things together create a sense of belonging. So you can say a sense of space. You can also say a sense of belonging, but not in these American parks that are pretty typical. Oh, let's see, one more thing. I notice a lot of public spaces in the United States, and I'll try to show you two different videos that I've taken of this. They're in the worst land available. So if they have commercial land that they can't develop and that has no commercial value, they'll put a parking lot next to it and call it a park. I grew up in Houston, Texas, and the only place in Houston, Texas where I could ride my bike, other than the streets, was a bayou, which is basically a drainage ditch. It was the drainage ditch for the system called Brays Bayou, and along that drainage ditch for the city, they put a little cement shelf, and that was the bike lane. So my biking experience growing up was, a lot of it was spent on Brays Bayou, either going one direction to visit a friend, or then later I would go towards downtown when I just wanted exercise. But it's a drainage ditch. I mean, don't call it a park. Don't call it an exercise route. It's a drainage ditch with a cement access shelf, and the rest of it's asphalt, which I hate asphalt. But don't call it a park. It's just a drainage ditch. So we went to a park here a few months ago. I think I have the video in my phone, so I'll try to add it into the videos when I produce this compilation. We went to a park nearby, and it's worthless land. Worthless land, and they call it a park. And it's not maintained. It's a dirt road to access the overhead electric wires and like the plumbing for the area. And they call it a park. It's not a park. So again, a lot of American quote unquote parks are the worst land that has no commercial or utility value whatsoever. And they'll put a parking lot next to it, they'll put a sign, and they'll say, welcome to your park, and it's just crap. But in Europe, the parks are usually centered. It's usually in the center of town. Or you have a major park in the center of town, and then you have some other parks on the periphery, of course. But it's obviously land that has value and a view and things like that, where they want people to come together. It's not, on the slope of like this park that I went to today. It's on the slope of a mountain, which apparently they couldn't develop. And so then they just call it a park because all they have to do is mow it. So those are 12 distinctions that I see commonly. And, of course, I'm aware of exceptions. Like in Portland, Oregon, they have Mount Tabor, beautiful park. Sometimes the bathrooms work. They have no food, no drink. They do have seating, and they do have cover for rain and shade. They have no art or sculpture there. It doesn't have a water fountain. What it is, it's the reservoir of drinking water for the city. So it has some water, but I mean, it's not beautiful. It's totally utilitarian. I don't know. They have plants there, but you can't really call that landscape in a European sense. No architectural value, like nothing was put there. Oh, I'm sorry, they do have like one or two sculptures there on the backside of the park. I think they got pulled down by protesters, but sense of space, sense of belonging, yeah, a little bit more at that particular park. It's one of the best parks in the United States, and yeah, it's pretty well centered. So that particular park, I'm talking about Mount Tabor in Portland, Oregon. That, how many points would that get out of a possible 12? So I'll just say Tabor. It's the best park I know of, so that's why I'm using it as an example. I'll give it a 0.5 for bathrooms. I think it usually has bathrooms, but sometimes they're locked. No food, no drink. Yes, it has seating, so I'll give it 1 point for that. It has cover for rain and shade. I'm going to have to give it at most a 0.5 for sculpture because I think it has one statue of one of the city's founders. It doesn't have a water fountain, and I'm not going to call a reservoir a water fountain. Landscape, not really. Architectural beauty, like something beautiful to look at like you would see in Barcelona, no. Sense of belonging, yeah, I'll be generous. I'll give it a full point for that. And yeah, it's well located. So 0.5, now we're 4 points. So we're 6 points out of a total of 12 compared to what you would normally expect in a developed European park. Okay, back to this. While the epidemic of loneliness and isolation is widespread and has profound consequences for our individual and collective health and well-being, there is a medicine hiding in plain sight called social connection. I'm not really a fan of this baby language, but we got to go with it. Social connection is beneficial for individual health, also improves the resilience of our communities. They don't want resilient communities. They want weak communities that collapse and do whatever the hell they request. Evidence shows that increased connection can help reduce the risk of serious health conditions such as heart disease, stroke, dementia. We already said that before. They don't care about any of that. Communities where residents are more connected with one another fare better on several measures of population health, community safety, resilience. I don't know why they keep putting resilience in here without defining what that actually is. When natural disasters strike. Resilience when natural disasters strike. Prosperity and civic engagement. You think your government wants you to be civically engaged? They don't want that. They want you to be distracted by football, baseball, hockey, basketball, politics. I mean, my God, how many times are we going to talk about this Hunter Biden laptop? It's either an issue or not an issue, but solve it and move on. And I suspect that it is a problem. I don't know much about it, but the point is, how in the hell can we, as a powerful, developed, rich nation loaded with human and natural resources, how can we spend a year or more talking about the laptop computer of the President of the United States without solving it? Investigate it. If it's within the scope to investigate it. But my God, I don't even think we have a solution now. We've been talking about this for 2 years or something. Surgeon General's advisory lays out a framework. All right, this better be damn good. It better be better. It better be better. It should be better. I hope it's better than what I can come up with spontaneously going to the park this morning. And I'm just talking about parks. So let's see. I already know this is going to be a failure. Because here's another thing that makes European parks work. And that is, people have protected time. Parents get time off for their kids. In Spain, the typical workday is 6 hours a day. So typically in Spain, for example, people work from 10 to 1 p.m. Then they commonly have a 3-hour break for lunch. And that includes getting lunch, having a glass or a bottle of wine, and then going home and taking a nap. And then they go back to work from 4 to 7, and then the restaurants open at 8. And that's a 6-day work week in 6-hour work day in Spain. I mean, we saw it for the whole time we were there. But the point is, people have protected time to take a break. Americans, you go to work, you punch in at 8:30 in the morning, you punch out at 5:30 in the evening. Because of the distance between home and office, you typically have a half-hour commute either way. So that's another hour that you just lost. Whereas in Europe, typically you would walk to work, walk home, and somewhere along the way you'd encounter a park and a cafe, and you'd get a little snack, and you'd talk with your neighbors. So the structure is totally different. So part of what makes a public space useful is the fact that people have time to use it, not just on weekends, but they can go there and relax and enjoy the space. All right, so again, I'm just making this up spontaneously, even though I've lived the experience. So let's see what they come up with. This better be good. 6 foundational pillars. I'm glad it's only 6. Strengthen social infrastructure. Connections are not just influenced by individual interactions, but by physical elements of a community, like parks, yes, libraries. Europe has some good ones. Playgrounds. I would consider that to be a park as well. And the programs and policies in place. What does that mean? So that sucks. If they're calling these are their pillars, and they haven't even defined what their pillars are. To strengthen social infrastructure, communities must design environments that promote connection, establish and scale community connection programs. What is that? And invest in institutions that bring people together. That's remarkably vague. So, sorry, let me go back to, I am going to take a tangent, and I'm entitled to take a tangent, and so here's the tangent. I had mentioned, starting with 2 quotes from Nietzsche. One was, I contradict and criticize as has never been contradicted and criticized, but I am nonetheless the opposite of a negative spirit. He says something to that effect. The other quote that interests me in this context is where Nietzsche says, sorry, I don't know why that's not moving. It's probably disconnected. Nietzsche says, this we should learn from artists. How can we make things beautiful, desirable, and attractive for us when they are not? And in themselves, I think they never are. This we should learn from artists while being wiser than they are in other matters. For with them, this subtle power usually ends where art ends and life begins. But we want to be the poets of our lives, first in the smallest, most everyday matters. So again, in the second quote there, Nietzsche was basically saying exactly how he finished it. He said, we want to be the artists of our lives. So being an artist, the metaphor there is you take something ugly and you turn it into something beautiful. A piece of clay becomes a pottery, a stone becomes a sculpture, whatever. And same thing here. We should try to take this ugly situation, which no one reasonable can ignore, and turn it into something beautiful. So that's the goal here. Strengthen social infrastructure. This was close to worthless. And it's even more worthless if they didn't put any money behind it. So at the bottom of this document, they better talk about how they're going to fund this. If they had $6 trillion to waste on COVID, which comes out to $18,000 per person for the worthless results that they got with 4 times increased death compared to the rest of the world, then they better talk about how they're going to fund this toward the end of the conversation and how they're going to give people protected time. So that would mean like raising the minimum wage to something dignified, not the $7.20 an hour that it currently is. Enact pro-connection public policies, national, state, local and tribal governments play a role in establishing policies like accessible public transportation or paid family leave that can help support and enable more connection among a community or family. Yeah, well, that was exactly it. Public transportation certainly helps. Paid family leave, you got to have time to go to the park if you're going to use the park or whatever other public space. Mobilize the health sector because loneliness and isolation are risk factors for several major health conditions, including heart disease, dementia, depression, suicide, violence, as well as premature death. Healthcare providers are well positioned to assess patients for risk of loneliness and intervene. That's bullshit. So as a doctor with 3 different diplomas that are titled doctor, and I'm just going to give you my quick experience on this. In chiropractic college, I think the most we ever had was a class in abnormal psychology. But we never had any training, for example, in therapeutic counseling. In naturopathic medical school, we had a lot of training in therapeutic counseling and psychological assessment and addictions and disorders. Those were the name of some of our classes. In so-called medical school here in the United States, even having gone to an osteopathic program, which is supposed to be everything that a medical program is, plus manipulation, plus, or so-called manual manipulative therapy, and there's supposedly it's like a holistic perspective on things. We had no conversation whatsoever on how to assess patients for loneliness and intervene. And here's something I said about 10 years ago, 12 years ago in a conference. Again, it was totally spontaneously. What I said was, in medicine, we're trained to interpret social problems as personal shortcomings and then put a disease label on it. So you go from a social problem to a personal problem, and then you go from a personal problem to a disease, because you have to turn it into a disease to then go with a drug. And then you say, oh, well, you're depressed, that's your disease, and here's your solution. So medical doctors in the United States, the vast majority of them, have no idea how to assess loneliness and no idea whatsoever on how to intervene. So he says here, healthcare providers are well positioned. Yeah, they're well positioned socially, but they don't have the skills to do it. And they, for the most part, I don't think care. That level of conversation would take time. We don't have the time. I remember when I was working in hospitals, they would just literally throw a chart at me that's 2 inches thick and say, that you got 3 patients waiting on you. You got to go. Because even showing up to my shift in the public health clinics next to the hospital where I used to work, I mean, I could finish one shift and then walk across this streetway to get to the public health clinic, which was right next to the hospital. And somehow I was already late. So just walking across the street without food, without taking a break, without anything, somehow I'm already late because lateness was built into the system. And then they'd give me a chart and they would say, you got 3 patients waiting on you with 2 inches of chart each. So that's 6 inches of paperwork. And I'm supposed to go in there and fix all that stuff in 5 minutes or less. And now here they're saying healthcare providers are well positioned to assess patients for loneliness and to intervene. That's total bullshit. Reform digital environments. We must critically evaluate our relationship with technology and ensure that how we interact digitally does not detract from meaningful and healing connection with others. This is all just propaganda. Deepen our knowledge, a more robust research. Oh, so now we need more research. Well, how is it that Europeans have already figured this out? Make public places that are beautiful and useful and give people time to enjoy them. Boom. That's it. Beauty, accessibility, beauty and accessibility. You give people beautiful spaces and the time and the logistical proximity to get there, they'll go there. And then here they say we need more research. I mean, that's just bullshit. A more robust research agenda beyond evidence outlined in the advisory. Evidence? There's no evidence here. Maybe they're talking about the master document. Must be established. Must be established. So we can't do anything until we do more research. So nothing's going to happen for years. To further our understanding of the causes and consequences of social disconnection. Understanding of causes and consequences. Boom, he already said what the consequences were, and we already know what the cause is. America doesn't have any beautiful public spaces for the most part. Everybody drives in their individual cars to their individual houses and their individual offices. We'll never have functional mass transit in this country because it's just not going to happen. And so none of this is going to change. We have to do this research to establish further our understanding of the causes and consequences. You already know the causes and consequences. You just said what they were, for the most part. Populations at risk and the effectiveness of efforts to boost connection. That is not going to happen here. Cultivate a culture of connection. That is not going to happen either. Informal practices of everyday life, norms of culture of how we engage one another, significantly influence the relationships we have in our lives. We cannot be successful in the other pillars without a culture of connection. Let me tell you how many times I've heard culture of connection, community, we're all a family. That's all bullshit. It doesn't have to always be bullshit, but it's mostly bullshit. That's what organizations say when they want you to go along with their bullshit, and they want you to commit 120% while they pay you minimum wage. Believe me, I've done it because I've worked in nonprofit schools. I've taught at universities. I worked in a medical nonprofit. I'm sure most of you know what the organization I'm talking about because I worked there for 11 years. And they always told us we're family, we're community, and all this stuff. And then the president would exploit the other volunteers. And then if a volunteer, if I refuse to submit to the exploitation of the president of that nonprofit group, whose only decent lecture was on community and family and all this social stuff, if I didn't give in to him, then they kicked me out of the organization. And that's exactly what they did. So all this culture of connection bullshit, I don't have any personal space for it. I've lived it, I've done it, I've heard it, I've said it, I've talked it. I've been part of it. I've been pushed in front of the crowd as a model of one of the participants in this culture of community. And then they fired me because I refused to let the president try to intimidate me into giving him hundreds of dollars worth of my own material. And so they kicked me out. Surgeon General's advice, and I'm not just being cynical about this, I'm just saying I'm aware of how this can be used as bullshit, and this is bullshit. Cultivate a culture of connection. You're not going to get a culture of connection in a society designed for isolation, where people are underpaid, underappreciated, undersupported, and that we're on the verge of chaos all the time here in the United States. We have no ability to hold corruption accountable, which creates a sense that people always feel ripped off here. Conservatives hate the liberals. Liberals, I guess, hate the conservatives or whatever. But it's always back and forth. So if you want to cultivate a culture of connection, people have to have some sense of fairness and justice. All the way, I would say fairness and justice. Maybe those are the same thing. Accountability and space, financial space to move and breathe and not have to work 3 jobs. I talked to an Amazon driver the other day. I'm always try to chat them up a little bit just to see kind of what's going on and see kind of what's the perspective that they have versus my perspective as a recipient of that service. You know, like I think the guy came a few weeks or months ago, and I said thanks for bringing the packages. I hope they're treating you well at Amazon because it's obviously, you know, one of the richest businesses in the entire world. I would hope that they're paying people and treating them well. Of course they're not. So they're not even employees, you know, they're just independent contractors. So they got no benefits, they got nothing, they're getting minimum wage or better, but it still feels like minimum wage because now with so much inflation here in the country, I mean, prices have basically doubled. So even if they double minimum wage salary from $7 to $15, it still feels like $7. All right, so so far this has been basically worthless. I am glad that he did say one thing. This was bullshit. Healthcare providers. The only thing that he said was paid family leave, but that's still very myopic. So what if I'm a individual unmarried guy and they put all their effort into paid family leave? That means that the people who are most lonely, who don't have a family, they're not going to benefit from that policy. And that's an example of an insight that was totally spontaneous, but also accurate. So establishing policies like accessible public transportation, or they didn't even put or paid family leave. Well, what if you're a single person? The most you're going to get out of that is a bus or a train. So they can't focus on paid family leave. It has to be paid vacations for, the bulk of the population. So we're almost finished. Surgeon General's advisories. He's got advisories, and this is the best they could come up with. Oh, sorry, they meant that as the document itself. I guess that would have been advisors if they had meant people. Surgeon General's advisories are public statements that call American people's. They didn't even do that right. It should be S apostrophe, not apostrophe S. Attention to a critical public health issue and provide recommendations for how it should be addressed. They didn't do anything that was of any value here. Advisories are reserved for significant public health challenges. Earlier they said it was an urgent emergency that need the American people's immediate attention. As the nation's doctor, the 21st Surgeon General of the United States, Dr. Murthy has focused much of his work, research, and public platform on how the nation can emerge from the pandemic stronger than before. So that's Build Back Better bullshit, including his recently issued Surgeon General's advisories on youth mental health, health worker well-being, and the Surgeon General's framework for workplace well-being. I mean, all of that's garbage. You can read the full advisory here, PDF. For more information, you can waste your time looking at that other stuff. Yeah, well, that sucked. So, one of the things that's commonly said is that if you've got no metric, you've got no plan. And they're calling this a framework. It's got no metric. So strengthened social infrastructure should say, X amount of recreational space per city space. So you would have to have some type of ratio, some type of balance between these asphalt jungles that we have and, let's put a green park or a greenway somewhere. So part of this is going to have to boil down to recreational space per city space. So no metric was provided there. Public transportation in the U.S. essentially doesn't exist. Paid family leave. Well, if he's going to say it, then put a metric there. You get 2 weeks off per year, or you get a month off when you have a baby, or something. That would never fly here in the United States, and that's why they didn't put a metric here. And that's why this is worthless. If it has no metric, you have to say, anyone who's going to say anything of any value has to make it real. You get 3 weeks off per year. Not just these vague statements. I mean, this is horrible. And like I said, this was worked on by dozens of people. And this is the best they can come up with. It doesn't even pass simple scrutiny like me reading it spontaneously on a Sunday afternoon. Healthcare providers are well positioned. That's the dumbest thing well, that's the dumbest thing I've read all day. But day's not over yet. Reform digital environment. What the hell does that mean? Reform digital environments. Most people do their digital, looking at videos and stuff. They do that at home. How are you going to intervene in people's homes in the way that they interact with YouTube or Facebook? That just doesn't make any sense. Deepen our knowledge. So this is a common way to state these things, but this is how they do nothing. They say, well, we need more research. Well, they're going to need a year to plan it and 5 years to do it. So that means nothing's going to change for 6 years. I mean, if you look at my list, they could implement, a national infrastructure and jobs program to build parks, highways, or not that we need more highways, but we need to maintain the highways and bridges that we have. I mean, where I live, all the bridges are rusty and they look like they're about to collapse. But what I'm trying to get to is high-speed train system. We need a high-speed train system that would help connect people. That would let people take vacations locally. It would create a whole new industry of hotels and restaurants around the train stations. That would kind of invigorate the national economy. And yeah, we could do some parks along with that. So what if we did high-speed rail and public parks across the country? We have the money to do it. We have the space. We have the technology. We don't have the will to do it because they're going to waste another 6 years before they even come up with a plan. I can come up with a plan in 30 minutes, at least an outline of a plan. And not even 30 minutes. I just did it in 30 seconds. Cultivate a culture of connection. You're never going to have a culture of connection in the United States if people hate each other based on their political affiliations or religions or race or whatever. And if people are underpaid, they're always going to be cynical because they're always going to feel like they're ripped off. And when the government lets people lie, like Fauci, lie in front of Congress, and the whole country knows that these elitist, sorry, I'm just going to say this my way. The whole country knows that these elitist assholes have no accountability. In fact, they get paid for it. So after fucking the country over for the years, for decades for that matter, but especially during the pandemic, how is Fauci held accountable for that? He got a $5 million book contract, and then he got a teaching position at one of the major medical schools. And so everyone in this country who's awake at any level knows that he's a fraudster and he ripped off and he hurt the country. And his accountability was non-existent, and then he got rewarded with millions of dollars. So, and then he actually did a video clip the other day where he told people, he said, be aware of misinformation. He said, be aware of misinformation, and he's the king of misinformation. I did a 5-part video review of his legacy interview in the New York Times, and the whole thing was just pure bullshit. Bullshit and evasion. So everyone in the country, again, who's awake on any level, knows that he is corrupt and responsible for the deaths of people, whether it's 10 people or 10 million. He's responsible for the deaths of people. And the rest of us are held to a high level of accountability with parking fees, highway passes, taxes, school taxes, property taxes, all this stuff. And of course we're going to be cynical and feel ripped off when we see a guy like Fauci who rips off the country, hurts people to the point of causing unnecessary death, which then qualifies as manslaughter. And he gets off free. And not only gets off free, he gets a free job. He gets a job where he'll have to do nothing. And he gets a $5 million book contract. So if you want a culture of connection, you can't have a culture of cynicism and a culture of connection at the same time. So if they want people to feel connected, we have to reduce the cynicism in this country. If you want to reduce the cynicism in this country, we have to create a government that actually works and holds people accountable for their misbehavior. Otherwise, people like me are held accountable all the time for tax. I mean, I got to pay these property taxes. I got to pay a highway toll thing because I'm an American driving on an American highway, and I have to pay taxes, sales tax, property tax, car taxes, inspection taxes, and then on top of that, I got to pay for going through a whatever the highway was. So I'm accountable all the time, and I have to pay my stuff. But the whole country is looking at these politicians implement policies that kill people, and they're not only not held to any account, they're actually rewarded for it. You're never going to have a culture of connection if people feel bitter and ripped off all the time. And I'm articulating it, but I'm not the only one who feels that way. The vast majority of Americans feel the same way. And people in other countries too. It's not exclusive to America. So that's my review for today. Again, when I'm making this video, I'll try to insert either in the middle or at the very end my spontaneous conversations at the park, where I started to put this list of things together, talking about how our local park is it sucks. So today, for example, is a Sunday. I was at the park Sunday morning in the middle of summertime, and I barely saw 8 people in the park. I was there for an hour, and and again, this is a major city in the U.S. I'm in a good neighborhood, in a good, decent part of town, with a good density. It's not like I'm out in farmland or something where no one would come to the park. But no one comes to the park because it's ugly. It has no bathrooms, no food, no drink, no seating, no cover for rain, no cover for shade, no art, no water fountain, no landscaping, no architectural beauty. So no one has a sense of space or a sense of belonging there. And so people don't use the park. And that's why in the United States, we continually have this alarm about the devastating impact of the epidemic of loneliness and isolation here in the United States, which is worse than smoking or equal to smoking. And this is all this U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy just gave us a big pile of bullshit that's not going to advance the solution to the problem. So that's my commentary for today. Almost exactly 1 hour of spontaneous conversation here, and I'll add the other videos on that, so it'll make it pretty much an hour and a half. You can speed it up so it doesn't take you an hour and a half. I typically watch videos at either 1.25 or 1.5 or double time, because speaking takes more time than understanding. And so for me to articulate my ideas, I'm processing the ideas as I'm speaking. Whereas you, as the recipient, you don't have to go through that processing time. You can just receive. So that's why you can listen to something at about twice the speed or so as it takes for someone else to say it. So anyway, do what you want and have a good weekend. And again, my intention here is to ultimately turn this into something positive. They've identified the problem. They have failed to identify and put metrics around the solution. So this is basically worthless. In fact, to make it even more worthless, they said we need a more robust research agenda. Well, screw it. That means it's not going to happen. It'll take a year or two to outline what they need to research. It'll take another 3 to 5 years to get that research. So now you're somewhere between 5 and 7 years out. And then for them to implement the solution, they would have to fund it, they'd have to get ready, they'd have to plan it, then they'd have to implement it. So you're 10 years out from a solution here. If they take action on this right now. Nothing's going to get better for 10 more years, I guarantee you. So, and so here's my positive contribution. as a nation in the United States, let's commit to high-speed rail, because with high-speed rail, then you get train stations. When you get train stations, then you get focal points. When you get focal points, you get new commercial activity, restaurants, bars, cafes, hotels around the train stations. And then you can put a park next to that. And then you have a beautiful city center that's starting to develop just because you created high-speed rail. So if you did high-speed rail and a public park system with the $6 trillion that we just wasted on COVID, that would transform this country. You've got the money. You know what you need to do it. You don't need to sit on this for another 10 years. That would be my solution. And I think my solution would be much more effective than the nothing that's going to come out of this. So this has been Dr. Alex Vasquez coming to you live on Sunday, July 23rd, 2023, with spontaneous commentary and ultimately trying to spin this into something positive. So hope you're all doing well, and I'll talk to you later.